It would be no exaggeration to say that US-China relations have always been marked by periods of turbulence, even when the two sides attempt to get along. Geopolitical competition, diametrically opposed worldviews, and much more always keep them at arm's length, even as attempts are made to diffuse military and economic tensions. This time too, ongoing attempts by Beijing and Washington to stabilize ties are sure to be upended with the visit of a US Congressional delegation to Dharamshala in order to meet the Dalai Lama. China, which claims Tibet as a historic part of its territory, has been less than pleased in the past when the exiled Tibetan leader meets foreign leaders. Beijing tends to view such meetings as an attempt by the Dalai Lama and his representatives to push the Free Tibet agenda. This perception causes it to issue thinly veiled but generally unspecific threats about protecting its sovereignty through forceful means. But this time around, there is added weight to this meeting between US representatives and the Dalai Lama, as it comes mere days after American lawmakers passed the Resolve Tibet bill. One of the visiting US lawmakers, Texas Republican Representative Michael McCall, characterized this bill as a statement of US intent to stand with the people of Tibet. While this alone would be enough to alarm Beijing, it is the content of the bill and all it could imply in the future which has Chinese leadership seriously concerned. So what is this bill about, and why would it be such a significant issue for China if US President Joe Biden signed it into an act? The Promoting a Resolution to the Tibet-China Dispute Act, or in short, the Resolve Tibet Act, aims to, first and foremost, compel China to resume negotiations with the Tibetan government in exile, talks that have officially been stalled since 2010. Furthermore, the bill, when passed and made into an act, calls on the US State Department to counter false Chinese narratives about the history and culture of Tibet. In doing so, the act will explicitly state that the US rejects China's claims that Tibet has always been a part of its territory. And speaking of the territory, the act, very significantly, officially gives the geographical definition of Tibet, which is not the same as the one used by China. When China says Tibet, it only refers to the area now called the Tibet Autonomous Region. The Resolve Tibet Act instead follows the Tibetan definition, which not only includes the autonomous region, but also areas that are now a part of various Chinese provinces. Finally, the act states that insofar as the US is concerned, the conflict between Tibet and China is unresolved, and the legal status of Tibet remains to be determined in accordance with international law. This last statement very directly contradicts China's frequent assertions that Tibet is an internal matter and an inviolable part of its territory. The explicitly stated parts aside, China is unlikely to rest easy with all the possible implications this bill could have if it were passed into law. Consider the various findings the bill includes. Among them is an assertion that the US has previously recognized that China had annexed Tibet in contravention of international law, or that Tibet is an occupied country under the principles of international law. Most alarming for China, perhaps, is the section under findings that states that, back in 1950, the US State Department had not only affirmed that the Tibetan people have a right to determine their political destiny, but also, should further developments warrant, Tibet may be recognized as an independent state. To be clear, the bill does not indicate or recommend any such recognition, but the merest hint of such a possibility would be sure to rankle Beijing. Hypotheticals aside, it is also a valid question to ask how the US would compel China to engage with Tibetan representatives. For talks, given that Beijing has been unwilling to do so for more than a decade, the likely answer is diplomatic pressure. Pressure that this act would enable in the future, and could even include the threat of sanctions. This is no ideal speculation either. Just last year, the US sanctioned Chinese officials for carrying out a policy of forced assimilation in Tibetan schools. It is not a stretch to imagine that the US could impose new sanctions on the basis of human rights violations against Chinese representatives, not just in the autonomous region, but the entirety of the area that the US will now recognize as Tibet. These sanctions may not even be limited to just government officials. In the past, the US has imposed sanctions on companies operating in Xinjiang, where Washington accuses China of carrying out genocide against the Uyghur people. At a time when China is attempting to increase foreign investment in the Tibet Autonomous Region, such sanctions, or even the threat of the same, may keep investors away. Do tell us what you think about this video in the comments section, and for more news updates, subscribe to India Today.